and a quiet hush falls over the room as we're about to get underway on this breakout session on Better Perspectives, Public Service in a Global Village. Thank you all very much for making this choice. I wondered whether James Wolfenson was going to trump us, but we've got a really good mix in this room to have a good discussion about the topic. To help us along the way, we have three excellent speakers. Paul Kirby from the UK, currently Head of Public Sector at KPMG. Ryan Orange, who is substituting for Ian Rennie from New Zealand, who couldn't be here today. And also Professor John Halligan, who is substituting for Sofian. I'm not going to read their bios. You all should have collected your series of handheld devices, and you can read their bios in full. What our speakers bring today, as well as better perspectives, is a diversity of perspectives. We have perspectives from the UK and New Zealand, which sometimes are the usual port of call when we start to look at overseas comparisons, kind of policy developments, service delivery, innovations. But that also begs the question, can we just parallel import those policy and service delivery innovations into Australia without making some kind of adjustment for cultural and social context? Professor John Halligan brings an informed academic perspective, particularly given a research study he's doing across a number of Anglophone countries, again including the UK, New Zealand and Canada. And the other part of the topic that I think is interest is this notion of a global village. Quite clearly, globalisation and the corresponding flows of people, information and capital has seemed to have shrunk the world, and particularly the impact of technology, making us feel that we're much more closer together. That notion of if the Dow falls in the US, we're going to feel it here in Australia, particularly when it comes to economic shocks. But does that necessarily make for a village? And they're some of the questions I'm hoping that we'll be able to explore through discussion with you and through discussion with our speakers. In terms of our proceedings today, I'm going to keep this short and sharp, and I've told our speakers they've got 10 minutes, and at 9 minutes I'm going to ding the glass. And I do have to remember that it's not, I'm from a Greek background, when you ding the glass, usually means at a wedding reception you kiss the person next to you. Please don't do that. This is a no-touching kind of conference. I am going to be taking questions through your devices, and in fact my first questions to the speakers will be informed by what comes through. I want to say by Twitter, but it's not, but it's like our internal Twitter. And then I'll throw back to you to see if we can open up for a discussion. Now, you should all have a handheld device, which will allow us to go into our first poll of this particular session. And I'm just waiting for the gentleman up the back to bring up the polling. It's up? Oh, it's not up for where I am. Okay, quite long, so I'm going to read them, and then we're going to start that nice 10-second countdown music. So, how well does your organisation understand and learn from outside Australia? Pick the closest one. You're highly connected with your counterparts in Asia and elsewhere. You've got multilingual staff. You connect and overseas. You monitor what goes on, which means that you're informed by reading international journals, including, I think this is a really tall order, those published in languages other than English. You visit other countries often. You read about experiences from English language sources from time to time. You monitor developments on the web, and you pay little attention to what happens in other countries, not really relevant to our work. The one that resonates the most, some of those are a very tall order, so if you fit 3 of the 4 criteria, I reckon that's a match, and your 10 seconds starts now. Okay, and 61%, which wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I consider myself relatively informed as part of the role I undertake in the Victorian Department of Canberra and Cabinet. I'll put myself at number 3 as well. So, without any further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Paul Kirby, who's going to kick off proceedings for us.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious this thing about the global village of what gets lost in translation. I picked up a badge the same as Maria's. It says, proud about Victorian public services. I have to say, in the UK, I've been accused many times in an insulting way that I'm on the journey to taking the UK back to Victorian public services. I've only just realised now that I should be proud to have done that. Look, I'm kind of conscious that you're a developed country in Asia, and I'm from a developed country in the UK. ultimate usual suspect. So, we're here talking to Tony Shepherd and everybody wanting to know what's happening in the UK. Done lots of meetings in the last few days in Australia. And what people want, I said, what do you want to talk about? They say, tell us about the cuts. Tell us about the cuts and tell us about contestability, frighten us, go on, scare us. So it's like sort of being, Saw 29 in the horror movie series that people are kind of asking for. So just to give you a bit of a feel for that. So the UK had the ultimate global proposition about funding its public services. So we were spending 50% of GDP. We were taxing at 38% of GDP. So that was sort of US taxes for Scandinavian levels of public services, a pretty good way of doing business, very popular with the British public, and funded by Chinese borrowing. So if that isn't kind of a global village proposition, I don't know what is. Now look, we decided not to put taxes up to 50%, which is what they are in some European countries. We're aiming to kind of spend 40% of GDP by 2017. And over a kind of 7-year period then, there's a big retrenchment of bringing things back into line. Now, that is painful, but it's worth saying that half of public service spending, so this is all public service spending at all levels of government, is being protected in real terms. So health spending grows slightly, school spending is held flat, international development is increased, so that we're the only country in the world hitting our obligations in that. So we've raised it 40% in the middle of all of these cuts. So there have been some important things about values to state and how we've gone about this. In the half that hasn't been protected, it is tough. It is tough. So you're seeing cuts which perhaps people thought would never happen. So for example, there are 25% less police officers than there were 2 years ago in the UK. So cuts into areas which people thought you couldn't do. Every public service has been on strike, some several times, some have kind of gone back to work. So it's been a kind of difficult time. When you look at the equivalent of Canberra, the central government level, those cuts are bigger. The average is about 50% cut over those periods. That's 5-0 in those areas. So you could look at some are bigger, Departments of Communities at 70%, for example, but averaging about 50%. If you come to Whitehall in London, wonderful city to come to, you would find that about half of Whitehall now is closed buildings, many of which even in the last 2 years have been knocked down and are being redeveloped as flats and kind of hotels and other buildings. So it is significant. If you looked at something equivalent to the Australian public service and central government, I mean, in 2004, that was just over 600,000. At the beginning of this period in 2010, it was 500,000. Now, 2 and a bit years later, it's down to 400,000. By 2017, it will be about 300,000 people. So these are big cuts. About 500,000 public sector jobs have gone already, and probably another 200,000-300,000 to go in the next couple of years. So this is a big level of change. I think if you just tried to do all of that without an idea of reform and what you were trying to achieve, it would be very crude. There's not yet been a single headcount reduction figure in the UK government and public sector. Nobody has ever set one. Nobody has ever made that the goal. The goal has really been about changing what happens and having a reform plan. So this has really been about trying to have a philosophy. So, for example, there's a big push to give power back to individuals, to families, to communities. So in the big service spend areas, education, health, social care, childcare, for example, our kind of philosophy is really clear. Rich people have their own money, have a market, go out and make their own choices. And we want everybody to have the same choice. So the 9 out of 10 people who are funded by the state are getting the money in their own hands, either in their own bank accounts for people with disabilities or money following their choices in the school system. Now, you can only do that if you're willing to kind of open up provision. So now in the UK, anybody can kind of start a school. The majority of our public schools for 11 up, secondary education, are now private. In KPMG, we took over a local failing school in the poorest part of London, made it the KPMG Academy. Now kids are kind of coming through that aiming to go to university, aiming to go to Oxford and Cambridge, same kids, same places, different approach. People are getting choices, things are kind of being opened up. Now, clearly you can't give all choices to all individuals and families, and so in those areas where it's still the public sector to buy things, they're being commissioned. We have a history of that, it's not kind of day zero, but areas at the moment, for example, like probation services, national services, are being privatised. So that's being opened up to the market, people being paid by results for what they achieve. If they, we haven't been good at tackling reoffending, so people will be rewarded if they kind of do better than the service before. So there's a lot of kind of change taking place. It is about, I think, in central government, giving power away. I'm really proud of the fact that our central government is getting smaller, that the buildings are getting closed. I'm proud of the fact that we're decentralising power to local areas. Local government, okay, it's had a 35% reduction in funding. This is money that funds adult social care, children's services, it funds public transport, local highways, services people care about, 35% cuts. But it's had decentralisation. There used to be 90 jam jars of cash. Now there are just 2 or 3, and one of those is sort of 80 or 90%. So people are getting freedom, but they're getting the difficulty to deal with themselves. But do you know what? When you give money to individuals, when you pass it down to local areas, kind of people do well. Virtually everybody in the UK is underspending their budgets. So these budgets which are being cut, they're underspending. They're cutting quicker, harder. They want to do things differently in the future. Now, I'm not saying it's not easy. It is really, it's really challenging, but actually we're getting somewhere better. So decentralising to the local level, opening up services to whoever wants to provide, who's willing to be paid if it works, and to take the risk that they won't if it doesn't, and giving power, most importantly, with most of the money, to individuals and to their families to make their own decisions in a grown-up way about their own life. Now, these are really difficult for smart, bright public servants, because I've been one too for a long time. Like, we know best, we know what is good for people, and we tend to think it'll all go wrong when the money leaves our office, so we put in place lots of controls, and we try to kind of make sure that what happens is what we think is best for people. Well, actually, in the UK now we have a different philosophy. I think in many parts of Australia that same philosophy is trying to work its way out too. One which is about kind of trusting people, giving government back to people to make their own decisions. And in some cases, this is not complicated, it's just being businesslike. So when you have to make cuts, instead of sort of benignly going digital, you actually have to kind of just go digital and close the other channels down. You have to kind of just do things differently. Instead of worrying about back offices, you take it off departments and you put them together into 2 or 3 giant back offices, and then you privatise them. You get on with things. You do what the private sector's been doing for years. I mean, I don't kind of buy the idea of civil service reform. I've been saying that to John in the last 24 hours. I think it's a Victorian notion, not in the Melbourne sense, but in the 19th century. Right, there are I think about 50,000 people in the UK, 1% of public sector workers, who do something unique and special, which is policy work and assisting politicians. And the other 99% do jobs that are actually entirely capable of being done by NGOs or by the private sector. And actually, once you open your mind in that way, you tend to see somewhere in the world, not just in public sector conferences, but in the private sector, what those kind of inspiring answers are. So I think this is all about kind of opening up. It's recognising that 1% of us are truly special and different, 99% of us aren't. And actually, in the UK, we've had to get on with this, but what we've actually been doing, I think, is using it as an opportunity to do what we've wanted to do. So I hope that you will look at the UK and not to copy it. Much of it you won't like. Some of it is kind of wrong for you, but actually to say, okay, you may not have to do this, but would you like to? Is this the right thing? Is it about opening it up? Is it about giving power away? Is it about leading ourselves in 100 different directions, not knowing what the destination is, but enjoying that journey, having the confidence that our role is to allow others to kind of find the way forwards. So thank you.
Well, this is going to be a more interesting session than I anticipated. I think I prepared the wrong speech because I can't really compete with 50% cuts. And I think it will be a fascinating discussion about whether big society is really a platform for policy reform and government reform in the UK. But I'm also going to talk about reform. I'm going to talk about reform from a New Zealand perspective. I'm going to get a little more mundane about benchmarking and about comparative learning and about the degree to which I think when you look at some of the pieces that are working really well in the New Zealand public sector at the moment, they are things that we have nicked. We have nicked them off other countries and we have adapted them to our environment and they are serving them very well, serving us very well. And I do think that it is a very important platform for learning from each other in this point of global experimentation. Because I do think, and I said at a breakfast this morning at the New Zealand High Commission, that when you look at what's happening in Australia, what's happening in the UK, what happened in New Zealand with a change of government coinciding with fiscal constraint, you see some pretty radical changes in perspective about what the public service is about, how much it gets to spend and what it gets to do. And where I completely agree with Paul is that it's what you do with that moment. It's what you do with that moment of crisis. Because actually sometimes it takes a crisis to be able to reform. And when I look at the changes that we're going through in New Zealand, while many of them are actually driven centrally by a desire for collaboration and achieving collective impact, we wouldn't have the momentum for them without the fiscal constraint that sits over the top of that, that forces people to concede that they must, in fact, do things differently. That if you are going to have to deliver better services and you are not getting any more money, full stop, then that creates an imperative in which you must change the way that you are doing things. This, for me, is something that's quite a common experience across public sectors in the world now, and is something that I think drives greater momentum towards trying to learn from other jurisdictions and picking up what you can from it, because reinventing the wheel is a silly thing. Now, you can't just pick something up from somewhere else and drop it in there, but we've got to learn what we can. So the context is obvious. We all need the ability to learn quickly. We're all trying to adapt systems. There isn't a clear blueprint for what we're doing at the moment. And it's not just change for this moment, it's change, it's an ongoing capacity to change. It's building an adaptability into our systems that hasn't been sufficiently there before, because this is not a one-off change. This is a change that's going to continue to hit and strike us, and I actually think we're shifting into a bit of a different place. And New Zealand has many of the same challenges as Australia does and as the UK does, but obviously has a range of different contexts. So reform for us, and I'm not going to go into this, I talked about this at the High Commission this morning and I picked up on some of it yesterday, but at a headline level, our reform is about results, it's about stewardship, and it's about system leadership. It comes in a context of absolute fiscal constraint in which every department has a cap baseline and is not able to exceed it. We do have a cap on the number of public servants in terms of how many we can employ, and the government has set absolute limitations around that. But then it is said within those constraints, within those incentives, it's really about how we change results for New Zealanders. So we've picked 10 results, we've got people focused around them, we're changing what it means to be a steward of the system, we've changed our legislation to make it very clear that chief executives don't just serve the government of the day, they in fact have an obligation towards the New Zealanders of the future in the way that they run their departments. We are very focused on getting people to think about leadership of the system as well as leadership of their agencies. But I want to pick up just a few examples of things that I think that we've picked up and learnt from. One is the, and so four things. One is the performance improvement framework in New Zealand. It's what you call capability reviews here in Australia, and I think it's a classic example of interjurisdictional learning because it came out of the Blair administration's efforts in terms of utilising a capability review as a driving force in terms of trying to understand operational effectiveness in the UK. Now, it's just, without getting dragged into it, it's one of the interesting debates about the reform agenda in the UK. It's, of course, capability reviews got thrown out just at the point they were really starting to work because you had a change of government. And that's one of the things you always have to wrestle with. But fortunately, New Zealand had picked up the experiment and Australia had picked up the experiment and are working with how to utilise that tool really effectively in order to drive organisational effectiveness. And PIF reviews in New Zealand are making an enormous difference. And I'd highly encourage you, there's a range of things I'm going to talk about, they're all on the State Services Commission website. And PIF reviews, like many other reviews, they're fully publicly facing, they're independent, they come come in, they do a range of activities in terms of assessing where that organisation is, and it's completely changed the game. It's completely changed the game in terms of what it is to be a department in New Zealand and have a conception of where you are supposed to be in 4 years' time and whether or not you are positioned to get there. It's simply a conversation we didn't really have before. And that review process, which we've picked up out of the UK, has been instrumental in changing that mindset. Results themselves, which I touched on very briefly. When we were setting off into reform, I had the luxury of doing a little bit of a global tour and popped through Canada and the UK and Scotland and spent a bunch of time in Singapore, and some of these examples I'm going to talk about have come out of that. And we'd been looking at Scotland Performs. If you hadn't had a look at Scotland Performs, I greatly encourage that you do go into their website. Terrific thing. Comprehensive view of results that the Scotland Government is trying to achieve and how they're going on them. However, we picked up a lot of their intent and we did it very differently. I imported somebody out of the Scotland Performs team to come out and sit in my team in New Zealand, and I said, well, what works and what doesn't work about it? And the two things that we did very differently is Scotland tries to cover everything. We have 10 results. And I think that's been absolutely instrumental in terms of why our results are kicking and why Scotland's having trouble with getting real momentum around the results field. If you're trying to cover everything, that it isn't actually a set of results, and it will not be a focus for effective collaboration in government. And the other thing we did is we had really clear public-facing accountability. Each one of our results has a minister who is accountable for that result and a chief executive who is accountable for that result. And that chief executive doesn't actually hold the levers to deliver that result by definition because they cross agency boundaries, but we're figuring that out afterwards. We put their name out there in the public domain. I know it sounds incredibly unfair, in many ways it is, but we said, as a group of central agencies, we will support you to do what is necessary to make that work. You tell us and we'll change it. And that's the commitment that underpins the ability to work in a more adaptive and collaborative way to deliver on those results. So inspired by Scotland, but delivered in a quite different way. I've got a handout out the back, which I was going to talk to, but you'll just have to pick it up afterwards because I didn't have time to swing it all out onto your chairs, which is about our Kiwis Count survey in New Zealand. So it's our survey of satisfaction with government services that we run out across New Zealand. It's a direct copy of a Canadian model. So Canada's been doing Citizens First since 1998, and they do it at multiple levels of government, and we picked it up, purposefully copied it so that we could have a comparator base in terms of looking at the performance of services, and we've been running that since about 2007. And I won't trouble you with going into the results of it, although I want to use an example from it in a moment. The innovative thing we've done there is we've gone from what was a periodic survey we were doing once every couple of years and spending a bunch of money on to something we're now doing monthly. Instead of surveying thousands of people every few years, we survey 432 people every month, and we have rolling, real time in that sense, reporting back to services across our system in terms of how the public is perceiving them and how that is changing by utilisation of rolling averages. The last one of the four that I wanted to mention was our leadership program. This new experiment for New Zealand. We've got a very devolved system. We've had no centralised leadership development processes in our system for a long time. It's not serving us very well, and as we need to get a complex of skills for the leaders of our future, we're trying to figure out how we can do that more effectively. Now, the place I went to look at that was Singapore. A lot of differences between the Singaporean system and the New Zealand system, and a lot of differences in the context. And there's absolutely no way we could transport the Singaporean system into New Zealand. If you're not familiar with it, you should go and look at it. It's amazing. I used to work for McKinsey & Company, global consulting firm. It's a lot like working there. It's an up or out policy. You hit a certain threshold, you're selected right out of university into a fast stream, and in 10-year segments you either hit the grade or you don't hit the grade in terms of elevation to another level. We couldn't implement in that New Zealand. It simply wouldn't work with our cultural base. But what we have taken from that is, as we're thinking about our graduate program, our emerging leaders program, and the way we work with senior leaders, we're actually being largely inspired by what they do inside the Singaporean model in terms of how they make that happen. The thing I want to finish up with was just a reference about why I think benchmarking really matters, and a plea that we all try and think about and commit to investing in cross-jurisdictional benchmarking in a way that really works. I get a lot of OECD stuff. It doesn't help me a lot because it's all retrofitted to apples with oranges and pears and peaches. But in the Kiwis Count survey, one of the things we did is we've just done a comparison to Canadian best in class. So we've taken all the services in New Zealand, we've compared them to the best performer, federal, state or local in Canada, and we've said, how do we do? And we've also done a comparison over time, and it's just, you won't be able to see it, but if you have a look at the diagram afterwards, it looks like this. The really interesting thing it threw up for me was the best performing service in New Zealand over Kiwis Count has always been our libraries. 84 out of 100 on the satisfaction score in terms of where you get. But you put them into that diagram and they're one of our worst performing services. Do you know why? Because everyone loves a library, so everyone says 84 out of 100. But when you compare their performance in terms of improving service over time and you compare them to a Canadian best-in-class reference point, they're actually in the bottom quadrant. That's a really, really interesting story. And it's not a story I can get through just generic comparisons or sweeping sort of OECD or Hackett benchmarks or Gallup international engagement surveys. It's something you can get through the sort of work that's being done with the comparative engagement surveys between the UK and the Commonwealth and some of the states, which I would love New Zealand to sign up for. And it really changes the way you can think about where your services sit. Now, this isn't about getting down on libraries. I love libraries. But it is about giving people a realistic perspective in terms of what they can strive for and where they can go. And actually, we are going to have to look across jurisdictions to do that. So I think it's a worthwhile investment.
So, well, Australia is in with two of the more centralised countries, certainly in OECD. And as Ryan was talking about this yesterday in another session, and as Paul has indicated today, there was considerable scope for moving things out of the centre. I mean, that's just a sort of opening contrast between Australia and the others. We can also think, to take up the point of the chair, this notion of village, but village could be defined in a number of different ways, and I'm not certain we necessarily, well, I necessarily think of the global village per se. There used to be talk of the Whitehall village in the sense of some sort of intimate interaction between politicians and civil servants going back a number of decades ago. But another way of defining a village would be the Anglophone countries who may be separated geographically but operate as a village, you could argue. And this could apply to other state traditions as well. And I want to come to the potential of the Asian village at the end. But I've framed this in terms of several tensions or conflicts or propositions. And the first one is this notion of globalisation versus contextualisation. And you've already had a dose of context from Christopher Pollitt yesterday. But there is this argument in any case that globalisation has plateaued or being impeded by the well-known GFC, or the crisis, which arguably has diverted countries more to internal solutions. And as the Economist, the British Economist, was arguing in its issue of last week, I think, what used to be called unfettered globalism has now become much more selective. So I think in terms of this global notion, we need to pick that up. But then there's this broader question of how public management movements have operated. Up until a decade or maybe 15 years ago, there was this notion of convergence. We were all converging on a new glorious future, which may have been the New Zealand model until everyone discovered they could never realise it, and neither could New Zealand. But there was this notion of some sort of public management solution for the public sector. But of course, since then, and this is where context comes in, there's been much greater recognition of plural solutions which fit particular contexts. And there's also this question that some of the traditional major centres and sources of innovation have either been displaced. I think the US used to be a more significant source, but for me, the turning point occurred even before the notion of reinventing government was created around about 1992. By then, US, to me anyway, was passé. We were already doing more innovative things than they were. It shouldn't be ignored completely, but I don't think it has the place it used to have. And you look at the condition of it now, and that would be an additional reason. But just to be slightly more provocative, you could argue that the UK has much less to offer us than in the past. Now, this, and we, or certainly the Commonwealth, maybe Victoria, though our chair can correct me here, often seem to have almost a default position where they look to the UK for solutions. And that prevailed for a very long time. But of course, if you look at the UK's records, so many of their imaginative ideas were not necessarily implemented, or they were reversed, and they ended up with a long period of chronic reformism. Of course, it remains to be seen where some of the things that Paul was talking about will just be another episode in this, because much of the rhetoric, certainly the rhetoric of last year, was not that different from the Blair time. So I'll leave you with that. We also need to bear in mind that the UK, until recently, had a public sector running at about 50% of GDP. Well, we got 35% at the same time. You could argue there was a bit of a difference there. So that's just for you to reflect on. So the second one is about recycling versus innovation. And there is this obsession with innovation, but we need to bear in mind the role of cycles, both past, and you're probably all aware of different toing and froing over time, decentralisation, centralisation, we all know about those. But there's also a question of thinking about what cycle we're entering into, and I'm afraid I'm thinking of the people who relate to the government based in Canberra. What is the cycle we're talking about there? Because we know that the Howard government had a commission of audit, and that went through a cycle, you could say, up to 2 terms. In fact, you could say it almost took them 2 terms to come to terms with accepting the public service as their advisors. But then, of course, once you start getting into the early 90s, there was almost a U-turn in terms of their approach. So you can see, and that was where the cycle turns, and they moved to different sorts of agendas. The point I'm trying to raise here is that often it does take time to implement programs. We've already been through joined-up government. It's come back to visit us because it wasn't resolved, and from a lot of the discussion yesterday, it's still being projected as what needs to happen over the next 5 years. But there's also a number of examples of recoups and retreads, and I'm just not trying to dredge this stuff up. I'm trying to say that unless you settle some of these things down, some of these problems which have seeped in incrementally over time, it is often difficult to move forward. I mean, I've done work in New Zealand, and particularly UK and Australia, which draws on either government reports or audit office reports of some sort, which look at the condition of various types of management. And invariably, there is some sort of consistent theme. There's a critique about how it's slipped. And if you look at the Commonwealth Financial Accountability Review in Australia, for example, you will see, though not in your face, but it is there, that many of the good management practices which were introduced in the 1980s have been lost over time. Now, if you listen to Steve Sedgwick, and I thought he made a plausible argument about this yesterday in response to a question from me, well, you know, a lot of these problems relate to the fact that too much emphasis has been placed on responsiveness rather than, that is to the political, to the politicians, rather than to stewardship. And I'm certain that is an important element of it. But then there's this question of innovation in an age of constraint. Is innovation, and we've just been told repeatedly, it would seem, that we have a decade of constraint confronting us, and I'm afraid this is, again, in Canberra, it may apply, but I understand it also applies to a number of the state jurisdictions. But it raises the interesting question of to what extent is innovation only going to be defined in those sorts of terms for the foreseeable future. Now, it's not that innovation can't come out of a commission of audit or because of a commission of audit. You could argue that Centrelink was a great innovation which came out and was created, as I understand it, devised by public servants in order to prevent a worse solution being inflicted on them. Now, of course, we hear that the post office may be the new solution, but and there was also the idea of how they handled employment services. Now, both those proposals in their time were of great international significance. So I think I should move on. The next one is the role of the state versus redesign of the public sector. And I just want to remind you of the fact that even though, again, in this city we've been immersed or overtaken by a Commission of Audit approach, which is a rerun of what was launched in 1996, there is another body of thinking which is important. I've already noted that the public sector, the national public sector here is small. It's the second smallest in OECD. And there are interesting issues about to what extent is the Commission of Audit approach driven by budget motives, which is what we hear more about, as opposed to more ideological ideas about the role of the state. Now, I don't have time to detail what Terry Moran and Peter Shergold were saying. You can read their papers in the March issue of the Australian Journal of Public Administration. But they both talk about the next stage. And it's not that there's not overlap with what the Commission of Audit might come up with, but the starting point is redesigning the system rather than the Commission of Audit mentality. Now, clearly I'm going to go through the remainder of the slides, 2 slides, very quickly. I was just trying to raise this question of how do we reimagine, how do we rethink the notion of the public service? And I think Paul's given us an interesting model here, but there's already sharing of policy, the back office is shared, and under Paul or UK solution, you back office it and then you get rid of it. There's much more emphasis on shared outcomes and accountability in terms of rhetoric, and that's with people outside. Service delivery goes out or down to the states. Corporate and other services can still be outsourced and other sorts of flexible operations. So that was just to leave you to think about. But finally, there's this notion of a regional, seeing the region as in terms of global public services. So this is, you could argue, I mean, it might be stretching it to call our region a village, but who knows in the future. So there's about 3 points to make here. With the exception of Singapore, in particular, Asian systems are not, at this point, I would believe, regarded as important sources of innovation of direct relevance to Australia. Now, there are exceptions. I don't want to generalise too much. But that's partly because many are still bureaucratised, politicised, and they're not cutting edge in our terms. Although you can see it in selected areas. So there is a question of, you know, when can we really start seriously envisaging new public service networks, not simply based on Anglophone countries? So at the moment we have financial, social security, audit, all sorts of networks, but what about the Asian side? So in terms of my final point, Chair, there is, of course, the well-known changing relevance of Asia in this century. There's the influence of new global powers, the growing influence of alternative models, state capitalism. It's in the paper today. Qantas is complaining about its opposition being buttressed by state-owned airlines. And there's been stories recently about Chinese corporations wanting to buy into Australia. So these questions are coming our way and we have to confront them. But, and this gets back, I think, to Sophie-Anne Effendry's final point from yesterday, there's this question of the modernisation of Asian public services, which we hope will occur towards the mid-century, and how our levels of engagement, I think to take his final point, will be raised as a consequence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I expect John's presentation will be available on the website, which will allow you to peruse it in more detail. And I think he laid down the gauntlet both to Paul in terms of the relevance of the UK and also to Victoria about what we now do. And I can certainly tell you that once upon a time, we always looked to the UK. That's not to say that we still don't, but I have to say more recent years we have broadened our perspective and are starting, particularly, I was interested in Ryan's comments about Singapore and are starting to look about Singapore as well. Thank you all for putting through your questions. They seem to me, I'm just going to summarise the 2 dominant themes that came out and then open up with a question to the panel. One of the themes that came through the questions was around the role of reform and cuts. Are they delivering the necessary impact? What's the evidence of the outcomes? What's the role of private providers then in service delivery? Are we simply shifting service provision and numbers? Very interesting question that came up about are we simply just cutting numbers and increasing, if you like, our engagement with the private sector? And what's the role of transparency and commitment and reform in relation to open data? The second dominant theme was this notion about comparative public administration, or what I think came through was the global village of public service. Can innovation be driven by comparison? I'm going to throw that question, I'm going to give you that, John, as the second follow-up. And then the role of national sovereignty versus international agreement, where do the boundaries lie? But the question I'm going to kick off with, that was just to give you a flavour of what came through and just to acknowledge people's contributions, actually follows on from the presentation we had about public service working with the ministers. And it's the role of risk, if you like, that is absolutely inherent in implementing radical reform agendas. And have ministers accepted those risks where those reform agendas are in place? And I'd be particularly interested to hear from Paul and Ryan about the relationship between the Minister and the Public Service in the implementation of reform and about that acceptance of the level of risk.
Okay. No, I think that goes to the heart of the question. Look, why has the kind of government got bigger? It's because politicians have continually wanted to respond to what the people are concerned about on risk. So how do they express that? They do two things. They either spend some money, that kind of shows that they're doing something, or they regulate, the sort of poor man's expenditure. And it's doing those things over time that gradually accrete up into a lot of spend, lots of levels of government and so on. So if I just use the example of crime, I mean, I think the UK public service agenda has been remarkably consistent. I was Tony Blair's Director of Public Service Reform 10 years ago. Actually, the things that are now being implemented were what were invented at that stage in pilot form, but now people are kind of cracking on and delivering them. But if you looked at what's changed, it's this decision over who should be accountable. So on crime, for example, when there was a surge in knife crime, the national government grew a function to take over that. It started to try and control where the money went. It started to try and kind of monitor it and so on. Now all of those people have gone and the control is at the local level. What now happens in my local area is the local police officer is now obliged to meet the public in the few hundred people that I live with in my community, and we each have CompStat style data about local crime. And then we talk about how to roster the police in our area, depending on which evenings of the week we think need to be policed. That's a change in accountability. It's been a big thing for ministers to give all of that away and to actually say, look, don't come to us. You know, these guys are kind of there to do the job. They've gone and got the money. Here's the information to kind of help you do your job. But this is the change in accountability. And I think unless you're willing to give away and treat people as grown-ups again, and to push the power away, then you're unlikely to get yourself out of a vicious circle of ever-growing government, ever spending more money.
All right, Ryan, can we hear from you on this issue as well, please?
Absolutely. So in thinking about risk, I think that risk is an enormous inhibitor for public servants to be able to do the job that they really want to do. And I think that our systems, New Zealand, Australia, UK, all of them create an environment in which, as we heard from ministers this morning, they don't want to be embarrassed in public. They don't want you to stuff up. It can be hard to explain to a public why this thing has gone wrong. And there's no getting away from the degree to which that has impeded our ability to innovate to the degree that we would like to. There's masses of innovation, but in the end, real innovation requires an ability to fail. I think one of the really interesting dynamics of the New Zealand reform environment, as much as we still struggle with this massively, which we do, it's a massive inhibition, is the tendency of change towards airing our dirty laundry in public. Now, three of the things that I talked about in my talk a moment ago, the results approach, the performance improvement framework review, the Kiwis Count stuff, all stuff that's only really come in over the last 5 years or so. All of them we openly and fully report to the public, and in all of them we fail all of the time. Sorry, that's the wrong way of putting it. We succeed on lots of things, but all of those reports highlight really significant problems. We've only had one PIF review out of all of the PIF reviews we've done over the last 5 years that's actually come out predominantly green in terms of the rating scale on it. Most of them have come out and said, actually, this department's doing this badly and that badly, and it doesn't have this strategy and it doesn't have a way forward on this. Kiwis Count does the same, open admission that there's a variety of services that are going backwards in terms of the quality of the service, while there are some that are surging forward. And as I mentioned yesterday around the results, we've set a bunch of results in there. Some of them we'll succeed on mightily. Others of them, there's an enormous risk that we're going to fail against them. So it's an interesting dynamic that hasn't yet played itself out in terms of, as we start to have this discussion, very, very related to what Amanda Vanstone was saying about the change in ministerial accountability, because that's it's an accountability that's actually sheeting back to the operational responsibilities of the department. When a PIF review comes out and says this agency isn't running very well, no one screams at the minister. It's not where the media goes. They say, well, what's the management of that agency doing about that? When the service goes backwards, they may grumble at the minister a little bit and the minister may front up on it, but in the end, it still sheets back as an operational issue. This is a real double-edged sword, however, because what it's creating is much more public transparency on the operation of our agencies. Now, that actually gives us, in some ways, more responsibility and more freedom to take responsibility, to take operational action to improve those things. But it also comes with a burden of public accountability that worries me in terms of how it's going to play out, in terms of the way it plays into that risk space. So that's a confusing answer in terms of something that's in motion.
I might ask you to pass the microphone to John, and we'll pick up that question now around kind of what I'd call comparative public management in the global village of public service. And the question around innovation, John, you sort of briefly touched on it in your slides and obviously been thinking about it. Can innovation be driven by comparison? Can we just simply look at other jurisdictions and look at their innovations in policy and service delivery and look and see if they work in Australia? I can't remember which speaker it was yesterday, but one of them sort of vetoed the whole kind of notion of, and I think it might have been Christopher Pollett, about best practice, saying that context matters. And you made that point in your opening slide. So I'd be interested in your observations.
Okay, can I also come in on the first question?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, in that survey I talked about of the 3 countries, risk emerged as a common theme. For example, if I can speak about New Zealand briefly, but I think the excellent Better Public Service report was partly prompted by the fact that the senior public servants and ministers were still too risk prone. And you can find, other generalisations in the UK and Australia as well. So that has been chronic problem. I think we can note that the efficiency dividend approach has long ago, worn out its usefulness, and it's always been a blunt, crude instrument. And much of the argument there is, well, politicians do want to cut, they shouldn't do it through that means, but do it through programs. And there is the interesting question about how the last Commission of Audit, the Howard Commission of Audit, while they implemented much of it, they avoided some of the big questions. We, of course, didn't have the same sort of crisis at that time confronting the UK. So the imperative was different. For example, as I recall, federal-state relations are recommended as something which really needed to be attended to and wasn't. And we're seeing that APIT is talking about a white paper. And so the failure of the system at the moment is important. But there was just the fact that they didn't focus on the big expenditure items as recommended by the Commission. But I just wanted to partly come back to Paul, and he can pick it up if he wishes. While I don't go for an any-state notion at all, there is a question of to what extent what I would regard as an ideal can actually be made systemic. So, I mean, it's the idea of having all this choice and being accountable, being co-production agents, if you like, sounds great. And there is a question of to what extent you can generalise from Paul's personal experience around the country. Well, on comparison, Australia has been, or many jurisdictions in Australia have been inveterate comparers and borrowers, but particularly from Anglophone countries. More recently, they have been looking at other OECD countries, and of course the odd exception in Asia like Singapore. And I think there's much to be learned, but we know there are many countries have, most countries have had very bad experiences of reproducing others' innovations without adapting them to local contexts. And Ryan's already mentioned a good recent example where several jurisdictions have picked up on the UK capability reviews, and it's often the case just as they were being terminated in the UK, but in each case they've been adapted to local contexts. So I think the New Zealand one from memory seems to be a bit more pedantic and demanding and pursuing the poor public servant, and the Public Service Commission one here in Canberra is less complex, though you could argue it deserves a critique for the fact that they sit on them for so long. You know, some of them have been sitting there for a year waiting to be released. So much for transparency.
Does anybody in the audience have a burning question? I've got a bank of questions in front of me that I'm happy to continue with. If you do, please raise your hand. While you have we have one, and if you could use your device, they are on at the moment. Name and agency, please.
Emmanuel Alfieris. I'm not from an agency, I'm from a bank, the Commonwealth Bank. I'm interested in if there's any examples or if you see it would be positive or detrimental for more transparency around the public understanding the cost of delivery of public service. So we all know what the government spends, but it's a big number, and part of that's, you know, income distribution or redistribution. Part of it is programs, and part of it is delivering services, and part of it's administration. But we actually don't know, let's say, the cost per individual or and be able to compare that. So, you know, that is, you know, we're the second smallest public service in the OECD that you mentioned earlier, is something that we've never ever seen in a public domain. So I'm wondering if that will be positive or negative to the dialogue about how we drive efficiencies.
Now, I have to declare an overwhelming personal bias towards transparency. But I think that's the future. I don't think it's an if, I think it's a when. And I think that the public's expectations of what they can see and how they can see it and how they can cut it themselves on an app in their house in order to understand where their tax dollar is going and what it's being spent on and where it flows to, I just think that's where things are heading. It's not completely straightforward. You have to invest to be able to do that, and the reality is the quality of our underlying systems simply can't do that at the moment. So while there's a pressing need, I think, to get to that ultimate position publicly, the reality is for ourselves, there's a bunch of those questions that departments are not well positioned to answer internally in terms of the quality of systems that get there. So I think there's a stepping stone. But I think that public transparency is a great motivator in terms of getting you to take that stepping stone, because it's one thing to know internally that you don't really know the value or the split of your activities in terms of how they truly flow, and it's another thing to have to admit that publicly, that you don't understand the dynamics of that. And I really just think we've got a momentum that we'll continue to build where that's just an expectation.
And I think transparency is like a really big deal. I think in the UK, I mean, in terms of the global village, we've learned a lot from the US, I think, which has really been kind of driving transparency hard. But I mean, just 3 examples I would use of things which are now underway that I think are making a difference. One really crude, making public bodies publish for every item of spend of £500 or more, what that item was, and putting it on the web, getting it out there. It completely transforms people's use of public money. I mean, that when a chief executive suddenly finds that the newspaper headline is that he or she spent £600 on a chair, believe me, they never buy a chair again. You know, that at a crude level just changes it. It begins to make you realise that you're spending the public's money and doing that. Second example that's happening in the UK at the moment is that all surgeons are having their clinical outcomes published by name, and that's working through discipline by discipline. It started with kind of heart surgeons. They were all terrified, saying, "Well, hang on, you know, all that will happen here is that we'll no longer treat the nearly dead because it will end up with a bad outcome." And actually, they're now the big advocates of the system, saying this has transformed our behaviour. because I have to look at mine, I have to look at everybody else's. I'm now learning lessons from other people, and I'm accountable. That's truly transformational by name of person, not by institution, going forwards. And third thing that I would highlight on the cost side is I've learned this. I don't know why it's a universal truth, kind of Newton's final law, but if you look where there are many people delivering the same service in the public sector, and you look at unit costs. I've seen in many services in the UK that if you could move the current average to the current 25th percentile, so not doing something that someone in Paraguay once allegedly did, but just where a lot of people already are, you always reduce cost by 20 to 30% in the system as a whole. And I once kind of gave a speech at a conference, which was, could we stop doing innovation and just do copying? Because actually, in the private sector, all of our incentives are to copy. If someone's doing something well, you have to copy it, you have to duplicate it. Look what's going on with mobile phones in the world, right? Someone does something, someone copies it. And actually, the easiest thing to do is to see something working and to do it quickly. And in the end, you run out of things to copy and you have to innovate. But it's a lot easier to copy something that already works, which I would kind of commend.
John has a comment he'd like to make.
Yes, well, of course, this question of risk comes into play here and can affect transparency, I think, for the reason Paul mentioned. But we also need to bear in mind that government's attitude wax and wane, and there are signs, which will be visible to all of you here, that the current Abbott government is being tighter about the information, and there's a question of whether that flows on in other respects to transparency. But then I just thought very quickly of two recent examples from the UK, and that was where I think they released details about the payments or packages for senior civil servants, which I thought was an interesting addition to open government, if you like. But then there's a question of, well, if you have all this transparent information, how much do you invest in that and how much will it be used? I mean, any people who work in the area of performance management, which is where, I've worked a bit, there's this big issue about, well, who uses it, to what extent, and how do you communicate it in a way which will attract use? And this, of course, applies to politicians as well as public servants. And again, there was this example of some performance document a number of years ago in the UK, and I've forgotten what it was about, but it was thought to be highly significant and had good news and all the rest of it, and it was plonked into supermarkets, but no one wanted to buy it, as I recall. It had to be junked.
So I'm now going to ask the panel for one final question, and we'll also give them an opportunity to make any final comments and statements, and that's about the use of the word reform. Somebody's asked the question, are we in a state of chronic reformism? Are we overusing the word reform? Should we be using it more judiciously so we can really signify its strength rather than being in this kind of perpetual state of reformism? And we might start with John.
I was hoping you wouldn't say that.
Oh, I was going to say that because I haven't put you on the spot first, and any other kind of closing comment you'd like to make.
Sorry?
And then if you'd like to make any other closing comment. Either take the question or a closing comment.
We need to bear in mind that cuts are not reform. I mean, and reform is just not rhetoric, it's what happens on the ground. So, when I was sort of raising a question of Paul, there's a question of how is it registering? Because it seems to me unless there's some sort of impact or some sort of definable outcome up to a point, I think there are problems with reform. And of course, measuring that over time is problematic because we know these things evolve and other agendas come over the top. I think that would be my closing comment. Thank you.
Ryan?
All right. I do have a closing comment, but just briefly on the reform versus continuous improvement, if you like, of the system. I think New Zealand is currently going through a reform, but the reason we're going through a reform is we left things alone for 25 years. So we shouldn't be going through a reform. We should have done 25 years of continuous improvement of our system, responding to what was perfectly foreseeable on the horizon. So the challenge of this reform agenda is to position ourselves so that we can do ongoing continuous improvement of the system rather than radical generational reform, which is no way to design a system. Now, very briefly, and I'm glad Paul's going after me, because there was one comment in Paul's talk earlier in the day that this is my last, I've done 3 speeches at this conference, it's my last chance to talk. And I just wanted to leave you with a thought. It was Paul's challenge. I think it's a really interesting one about whether just 1% of us are special or whether 100% of us are special in terms of being public servants. And I really do get where Paul's coming from in terms of a best sourcing model for government. However, when I think about the reform agenda that I am driving in New Zealand, I think it is grounded on why I believe public servants are special. And it is because of results, stewardship and system leadership. Because I think results talks to the motivational structure of why people are doing things. That doesn't give public servants an exclusive right. It just means that many public servants have a different motivational structure as to why they are pursuing a result, and sometimes that passion really matters in terms of getting things done. The second is stewardship, and it's the degree to which it's not just policy that carries stewardship of our system and carries it forward into the future. And stewardship can reside in the broader community, but that is something that is very special about our public sector in terms of its responsibility of carrying stewardship for the system. And that is why I think it is much broader than the 1% in terms of carrying that stewardship obligation. And I also think it's about system leadership. I have a vision in terms of our system where every public servant in our system thinks of themselves as a system leader. And I mean that genuinely, everyone. Everyone thinks about what they do through the lens of their agency, but also through the lens of their system. Now, that's not an expectation I carry for those that I contract with. And it is an expectation of those I work with as public servants. None of those are reasons for not going out there and working with NGOs in the private sector and doing it a hell of a lot more than we do at the moment. But it does lie at the heart for me of why public service is a very special calling.
And with time constraints, I might ask.
Okay, very good. So one quick answer to a question from before. This is strange to know, but in the UK, all the areas that have been cut, service outcomes have improved, and in many cases quite dramatically. Not saying there's causality, I'm just saying there's a correlation. Secondly, on public service reform, do you know, I think it is time to kind of put that phrase in the bin. I've kind of had that in my job title quite a few times. But could you imagine going to a conference called Private Sector Reform? It's kind of worth thinking about. You know, I think there's a danger of mistaking professionalism and public service ethos. So in my experience, doctors and teachers, if they're in private schools or doing private medicine, have the same commitment to professionalism and to their clients and to their pupils as they do when they work in the public sector. And I think we mistake the two too often. And therefore I think we miss the chance to engage with the professional agenda, and we end up creating a separate world called administration. And I think that's a mistake. And do you know what? I think people who work in insurance companies doing things that are very similar in work to people who work, for example, in benefits administration, have just the same professionalism around the things which they do too. So you know, I think it's about letting some of these walls fall down, opening ourselves up, because I think, you know, the world out there is just as committed and motivated as us, and just as special.
Before I draw the session to a close, I think we've got the obligatory evaluation question that needs to be answered, if they're going to bring that up. Oh, sorry, we've got another vox pop, and I think we'll get the 10 seconds going now. Do you draw from developments in other public sectors to inform your work? Yes, jurisdictions. Yes, other countries. Yes, both 1 and 2 above. Rarely, never. 1 second to go. And so, yes, we are looking outside and lifting our gaze above the horizon. And the second question is, how satisfied, give us some feedback and evidence of our outcomes, how satisfied have you been with this session? That unfortunately won't go up in real time. We could go on, I suspect, for another half hour on a really in-depth and stimulating discussion, but I do know people are hankering for a cup of coffee out in the exhibition hall. Please join me in thanking our speakers for their contributions.